Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're tackling a topic that seems to spark a lot of debate, and honestly, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding out there. Women and work in Islam. You wanted to really disentangle the misconceptions surrounding this, and we're going deep into Dr. Abla Hassan's book, Decoding the Egalitarianism of the Qur'an, to do just that. She really digs deep into the heart of this issue, and I, for one, am so ready to unpack some serious knowledge.
And I am here for it. It's so easy to get caught up in what people think the Quran says about women and their roles. But Dr. Hassan doesn't just hit us with a verse-by-verse analysis.
Mhm.
She really digs into how these interpretations have actually shifted over time
Mm.
and how cultural norms often end up overshadowing the Quran's central message of equality, which I think is really interesting.
Okay, so let's get into those misconceptions. One of the big ones is this idea that Islam just straight up restricts women from working, right? But Dr. Hassan argues that it's way more nuanced than that.
Absolutely. One of the most interesting points Dr. Hassan makes is about the concept of hijab and how that's often misinterpreted to justify keeping women out of the workforce. Now, hijab, like literally translated, means curtain or barrier, and a lot of times it refers to modest dress. But the thing is, nowhere in the Quran does it say that this equals the total seclusion of women from public life.
It's kind of crazy how a word or concept can be taken out of context like that and then used to support an argument that when you look at the bigger picture, it doesn't hold water.
For sure. And Dr. Hassan, she makes this brilliant comparison. She points out that some interpretations we see today, they actually echo pre-Islamic Arabia's views on women. Even though, and this is the kicker, the Quran was literally revealed to challenge those very limitations.
Wow, yeah.
It's almost like instead of drawing on the Quran's message of equality, some of these interpretations are mimicking, maybe unconsciously, but still the very systems the Quran sought to reform.
It's such a powerful point. Like, we're talking about layers of cultural baggage that have nothing to do with what the Quran actually teaches, but somehow they've become all intertwined over time. And it makes you wonder, how did we get here? And more importantly, where do we go from here?
Well, that's where those powerful voices that Dr. Hassan highlights come in. We're talking about early Muslim feminists and reformers who were asking these very questions over a century ago. Like, think about Qasim Amin, for example. He was arguing that a nation's progress, like its ability to move forward and thrive, was fundamentally linked to the status of its women, like their ability to contribute to society, their education, their participation, all of it.
He wasn't alone in that thinking, right? Dr. Hassan talks about other really prominent figures, too.
Oh, absolutely. Nawal al-Saadawi is another great example. Her work is so captivating because she gets right to the heart of it. She talks about this underlying fear that I think some people have toward educated working women. In her book, The Female is the Origin, she writes, and this is a direct quote, and it really stuck with me. She says, "They fear that if women hear their own voice, if they taste the sweetness of freedom and achievement, they will never return to the cage of silence and obedience."
Wow. Okay, talk about a powerful statement. You can practically feel the weight of that fear she's describing. And it makes you wonder, if the Quran is really all about equality, like Dr. Hassan says, then why is there this pushback against women who want to use their skills and talents in the world?
It's a great question, and it's something that a lot of scholars and reformers have wrestled with. You have to remember that with any sacred text, you're going to have multiple interpretations. So Dr. Hassan spends some time unpacking the arguments that are made by what she calls the traditionalist perspective.
So you mean the folks who believe that a woman's place is primarily in the home, focused on family?
Exactly. They often cite what they see as God-given roles, and they sometimes lean on the argument of economic necessity. Their perspective is basically, if a woman doesn't need to work to support her family, then she shouldn't.
Which is interesting because then Dr. Hassan digs into a specific verse that a lot of people use to support this viewpoint, right?
Yeah.
Verse 33.33, the one about staying at home.
Right. And this is where context becomes absolutely crucial. Because, see, that verse, it was revealed as an instruction to the Prophet Muhammad's wives. It wasn't meant to be a blanket statement for all women for all time.
Gotcha.
And Dr. Hassan's point is that when you take a verse out of context like that and apply it in this really broad way, that's how interpretations can become, well, distorted.
It's like reading one sentence out of an entire book and saying, yep, I get it. I understand the whole story. Like, it just doesn't work that way.
100%. And speaking of stories, Dr. Hassan dives into a fascinating one from the Quran that's often used to argue against women working. The story of Moses and the daughters of Shu'ayb. You familiar with that one?
It rings a bell. It's the one where Moses is at the well.
Yes. He meets these two women who are trying to water their flock, but they're getting pushed around by some shepherds. So Moses, he's a good guy, steps in to help them out. And later on, one of the sisters actually runs back to invite him to meet their father, Shu'ayb, who's a prophet. Now, people often use this story to say, see, women should stick to the domestic sphere. Look how much they were struggling with this simple chore. But Dr. Hasan, she's like, hold on a minute. Let's look at this story with fresh eyes.
I am here for it. What are we missing?
Well, for starters, these daughters are no shrinking violets. You know what I mean? These are independent women working in a very public space. And here's the kicker. They're the ones who actually suggest that Moses should work for their father. They're essentially hiring him. And that right there, that directly challenges the idea that the Qur'an inherently forbids women from engaging in public life or the workforce.
Wow. That is fascinating. It kind of flips the script on how that story is usually presented, for sure.
It does. And it sounds like Dr. Hasan is really pushing us to question those assumptions that we've maybe internalized over time and to think critically about these interpretations that we've come to accept as truth. And she doesn't stop there. She goes on to challenge the whole economic necessity argument, too. She says that it misses a much more profound point about the value and purpose of work. But we'll get into that in a bit.
So if it's not just about putting food on the table, that economic necessity, what is Dr. Hasan saying about the real value of work, especially for women?
This is where her argument gets really interesting, I think. It's like, if you reduce work to just a paycheck, right, you're kind of missing the bigger picture. She talks a lot about these psychological and emotional benefits that come with fulfilling work. That sense of purpose, building self-esteem. Those are important too.
So we're talking about more than just financial independence. It's about personal fulfillment, finding your place, all of that.
Exactly. And she ties this back to a really central idea in the Quran, this concept of humans being like God's deputies on earth. We are entrusted with this responsibility to cultivate the world, contribute to it. So if that's the case, her question is, why would women be excluded from that divine purpose?
Right. Yeah, sure. Come help us build this amazing world. But only if you absolutely have to.
Yeah, it's like that.
Yeah.
And she's saying that, look, by limiting women to this purely economic argument, we're ignoring the talents, the potential contributions they bring. This is about acknowledging that women have inherent dignity, they have agency, they should be active in shaping their lives and the world around them.
It sounds like she's challenging everyone listening to move past this binary thinking, this either thing, it's either family or career, when in reality it can be both and so much more.
Absolutely. And that actually brings up another argument that we hear a lot, which is used to kind of, discourage women from really going after those big careers or passions. And that's the whole motherhood thing.
Yeah, right. The idea that a woman's most important role, maybe even her only role, is to be a mother.
Exactly. And look, while motherhood is clearly a vital role, and it's definitely fulfilling for a lot of women, Dr. Hasan says, hold on, it shouldn't be the only defining thing in a woman's life. It's one important social role among many, not like the be-all and end-all of her existence.
Which, to me at least, feels like a much more empowering message and a lot more realistic when you consider, the vast diversity of women's experiences around the world.
100%. And here's another layer that Dr. Hasan adds into this whole discussion, and it's so interesting. She's like, okay, so we're over here emphasizing motherhood as the primary role for women, but what about the dads? Why is it that fatherhood is so easily reduced to just biology in these conversations?
It's true. It's almost like we're saying fathers aren't as essential to raising kids or that their roles are somehow less important, which is just there.
And by reducing these roles down to just basic biology, it's like we end up with this very narrow view of what it means to be a man or a woman. And Dr. Hasan's point is that we need to push past those restrictive definitions. Both men and women were capable of contributing to society, to our families, in so many meaningful ways.
So if these more traditional interpretations are missing the mark, as Dr. Hasan says, what's the path forward? How do we reconcile these different viewpoints? It feels kind of...
Yeah, and she actually does a great job of offering a way forward. She's very clear. Muslim women, they need to reclaim their rights and challenge those interpretations that are limiting their potential, straight up.
And she's not just talking about legal rights here.
Yeah, not at all. It's much deeper than that. It's about owning your own narrative, Defining success on your terms having the agency to make choices that reflect your values, your aspirations, not just what society expects.
So it's about recognizing that women have the right to choose how they contribute to the world, whether that's as mothers, professionals, community leaders, whatever they feel called to do.
Yes. And get this. She says this freedom to choose, it's not just an individual right. It's actually fulfilling God's plan. Because think about it. If we're pushing women to be financially dependent, totally focused on marriage, she's saying we're actually steering them away from their full potential as God's deputies on earth.
That's a really powerful way to reframe that conversation. It's not about like rejecting tradition. It's more about evolving our understanding of what it means to live a fulfilling life, to live in accordance with your faith, but also with your own goals.
Exactly. Dr. Hasan is advocating for this much more expansive view of what it means to be a Muslim woman today, one where your faith and your ambition, they aren't at odds. If anything, they're intertwined.
Yes, like recognizing that women have agency, that they can be a force for good in all these different aspects of life.
And that's a message that, honestly, I think goes way beyond just the Muslim community, this idea of challenging assumptions, questioning interpretations that limit anyone's potential. And it's something we can all benefit from, no matter who you are or where you come from. And it really makes you think, like how can we, each of us listening right now, challenge some of these limiting narratives we've been talking about?
Yeah.
How do we actually create spaces where women feel empowered to chase those big dreams, those aspirations, without being bogged down by these outdated expectations?
It's such a good question. And it's one that I think we all need to sit with for a minute. Like, what can we do right here in our own lives, our communities, to champion a more inclusive vision?
It starts with awareness, right? Like just noticing those subtle ways, and sometimes they're not so subtle, that we might be even accidentally perpetuating those limiting beliefs. We all do it. And then it's about questioning those assumptions, those things we've always been told or shown, and challenging the people around us to do the same.
So it's not just about laws or policies. It's really about a deeper change. Like hearts and minds need to shift.
Yes, exactly. It's about fostering this culture of respect and understanding where everyone feels seen, valued, empowered to really contribute their own unique gifts. And I think sometimes people are afraid of that. But equality doesn't diminish anyone.
Yeah.
It uplifts everyone.
It's so true. And that, I think, is the perfect note to end on, don't you think? We've been on quite a journey today, haven't we? We've gone deep into some pretty complex ideas, challenged some long-held assumptions, and I really do, that everyone listening is leaving with a renewed sense of hope, like a sense of possibility.
I think so too. We explored how cultural norms, how these different interpretations can sometimes obscure the true message of equality that's found really at the heart of so many sacred texts.
Right. We heard the voices of these like trailblazing Muslim thinkers who said, no, we're going to challenge the status quo, and they advocated for a more just and equitable world.
And more than anything, I think we've all been reminded that this conversation, it's bigger than just one faith, one community. It's for all of us, right? Like anyone who believes in the power of human potential, who wants to create a world where everyone has a real shot at thriving, that's who we're doing this for.
100%.
Yeah.
So as you go about your day, as you're listening to this, maybe on your commute, whatever it is, we hope you'll keep asking those tough questions, keep challenging those limiting beliefs wherever you find them. Don't be afraid to rock the boat a little, and never ever stop advocating for a world that embraces everyone.
A more inclusive world, for sure.
And a more equitable world. Yes. Until next time, keep diving deep, everyone.